12 employees do not make a real company. Stop pretending you belong here and leave before the board sees what a failure you became.
Her ex-husband mocked her small firm. Then it took control of his company. Where are you watching from? Comment your city or country below. What would you do if someone dismissed your hard work, only to depend on it later? Now, let's begin. 12 employees is not a company. It is a support group with invoices. Bennett Stroud said it loudly enough for the people nearest the stage to hear, and the laughter spread before Marin Holloway had time to decide whether it hurt. The annual Chicago Business Leadership Awards filled the ballroom with polished marble, amber light, and the soft clink of glasses carried between investors, attorneys, and executives who treated confidence like another form of currency. Bennett stood beneath a silver Stroud industrial emblem with one hand resting near the lapel pin Marin had helped design 9 years earlier. At 45, he had perfected the expression of a man who believed every room already belonged to him. His dark suit was immaculate. His smile was measured. Beside him stood Rowan Hale, his new fiancée and head of corporate communications, wearing a pale ivory dress and the careful attention of someone who knew cameras were nearby. Marin held a glass of sparkling water and looked at Bennett without changing her expression. She wore a deep amethyst suit, simple gold earrings, and the calm posture of a woman who had spent years learning that some insults were designed less to wound than to provoke a useful reaction. "How many people did you say work for you?" Bennett asked, though she had already answered. 12, Marin said. 12, he repeated, turning slightly toward the investors around him. Stroud Industrial has nearly 3,000 employees across 4 states. There is consulting, and then there is running a real company. One of the men beside him gave a polite laugh. Rowan lowered her eyes toward her drink, but the corner of her mouth moved. Marin noticed everything. She noticed the Stroud emblem on Bennett's lapel, the same shape she had once sketched on a legal pad at their kitchen table. She noticed the supplier from Ohio, standing near the floral display, the one who had called her 6 months earlier, asking whether Stroud still paid invoices within 60 days. She noticed Bennett's chief financial officer, Celeste Rourke, watching from across the ballroom with a face too still to be comfortable. Years ago, Marin had built the systems that kept Bennett's factories moving. She had rewritten vendor schedules, identified waste in shipping contracts, and spent winter mornings walking warehouse floors before the supervisors arrived. When the company recovered from its first serious cash crisis, Bennett presented the results to the board as his turnaround plan. Her name appeared nowhere in the presentation. When she asked for a formal role, he told her the board would never respect a title given to the chief executive's wife. After the divorce, he had security collect her factory badge in front of employees who once brought her problems before they brought them to him. He told her she had never truly belonged there. That afternoon, Marin rented a 400-square-foot office above a printing shop and placed one folding table beneath a window that faced a brick wall. Holloway operations began with 2 clients no major firm wanted, both within weeks of closing. Marin and her small team worked through invoices, inventory, payroll, and contracts until the businesses could breathe again. They did not have a private jet, a downtown tower, or 3,000 employees. They had 12 people who read every number before trusting it. Bennett lifted his glass. "Do not take it personally," he said. "Some people are meant to advise. Others are meant to lead." The laughter around him had faded, but he did not seem to notice. Marin looked at the emblem on his lapel one last time, then placed her untouched glass on a passing tray. "Congratulations on the award," she said. Her voice was even, almost warm. Bennett smiled as though he had won something larger than a conversation. Marin turned toward the ballroom doors. Behind her, Celeste stepped away from the crowd and checked her phone with a worried expression. On the screen was a message from one of Stroud Industrial's largest lenders requesting an urgent review of the company's financial statements. Marin did not see it. Not yet. She only walked into the cold Chicago night, while Bennett's laughter followed her through the revolving doors, confident that 12 people could never become a threat. The wind off Lake Michigan cut between the buildings as Marin stepped onto Wacker Drive, but the cold was cleaner than the ballroom had been. She walked 3 blocks before checking her phone. 2 messages waited from her operations director, Tessa Vale, both marked urgent. A third came from an unfamiliar number with an Ohio area code. Marin stopped beneath the awning of a closed cafe and opened the first message. One of Holloway Operations' longtime clients had received a notice that Stroud Industrial was delaying supplier payments by another 30 days. The second message included photographs of pallets sitting and used in a warehouse outside Toledo, each tagged for production orders that had already been canceled. Marin enlarged the images and studied the labels. The item codes were familiar. She had created the first version of that inventory system during the winter Bennett nearly lost the company. Back then, Stroud Industrial had been 6 weeks from missing payroll. Bennett spent his days reassuring the board while Marin spent hers walking factory floors, comparing purchase orders against actual demand. She found duplicate contracts, inflated freight fees, and a supplier agreement that charged the company for material it never received. Her corrections saved enough cash to keep the oldest plant open. Bennett thanked her privately, then presented the recovery plan under his own name. "The board needs one voice," he told her afterward. They were sitting in his office, the skyline reflected in the glass behind him. "They will not respect us if it looks like my wife is running operations." Marin had looked down at the report in his hands. Every number was hers. Every recommendation had come from her notes. "Then give me a title that reflects the work." Bennett leaned back as if she had asked for something unreasonable. "You already have influence. Why do you need recognition too?" The question stayed with her for years because it made erasure sound like gratitude. By the time their marriage ended, Marin had been removed from executive meetings, copied off vendor communications, and introduced at company events as Bennett's supportive wife. On her final morning at headquarters, a security manager waited near the elevator with an apologetic face. Bennett stood 10 feet away, speaking quietly to an attorney while Marin unclipped the brass access badge from her coat. The badge had allowed entry to every plant, warehouse, and executive floor. Bennett watched it fall into the manager's hand. "You were never an employee," he said. "Do not confuse access with ownership." Marin carried one cardboard box to the parking garage. Inside were family photographs, 2 notebooks, a coffee mug, and a printed process map Bennett's staff had never bothered to return. She placed the box in the trunk, sat behind the wheel, and cried for exactly 7 minutes. Then she opened one notebook and circled the sentence she had written months earlier. "A company does not fail when it gets small. It fails when no one is allowed to tell the truth." Holloway Operations began above a print shop with 1 folding table, 3 borrowed chairs, and a copier that overheated every afternoon. Marin's first client was a family-owned packaging company with 4 days of cash remaining. Her second was a regional grocer losing money because no one had noticed that the delivery schedule made half its routes run empty. She did not arrive with speeches. She arrived before sunrise, stood beside loading docks, read invoices line by line, and asked workers what managers had stopped asking. Within 2 years, her 12-person firm had stabilized 7 companies and protected more than 800 jobs. The office was still modest. The team shared conference rooms and carried their own laptops. But every person there knew how to find the difference between what a business claimed and what it could survive. Marin opened the message from the Ohio number. It was from Gideon Pike, owner of a machine parts supplier that had worked with Stroud Industrial for 23 years. He asked whether she could meet privately. By 9 the next morning, Gideon sat across from her in Holloway's small conference room with a banker's box at his feet. He looked exhausted. "They owe us $1.4 million, he said. "But they keep ordering more material." Marin lifted the first invoice. The quantities did not match normal production. "Who approved these?" Gideon slid over a purchase authorization bearing Bennett's digital signature. "That is why I came to you," he said. "Either Stroud is planning the largest expansion in its history, or someone is trying to make the future look bigger than it is." Marin looked through the glass wall toward her team. 12 desks. 12 people. Enough, she thought, to start asking the questions Bennett believed no one had earned the right to ask. Marin did not touch Gideon's banker's box for several seconds. She studied the purchase authorization first, then the invoice dates, then the delivery schedule attached behind them. Stroud Industrial had ordered nearly 20% more raw material than its confirmed production required, yet several plants were already operating below capacity. The numbers did not describe growth. They described an attempt to make activity look like strength. "Did they ask you to delay billing?" she asked. Gideon nodded. 90 days instead of 30. They said it was temporary. "Did they offer collateral?" He reached into the box and removed a copy of an amended supplier agreement. Marin read the property description twice. The listed security was a tooling facility outside Joliet, the same facility Stroud had used years earlier to support a bank loan. She looked up. Who prepared this? Their legal department. Marin slid the agreement toward Tessa, who had entered quietly and taken the chair beside her. Tessa was 39, precise, and almost impossible to impress. She read the first page, then the property schedule, and her expression changed. If the bank lien is still active, this cannot be offered again. Find out, Marin said. By noon, Holloway Operations had divided the records across 3 teams. One traced purchase orders against production forecasts. One reviewed public financing statements and property filings. Marin handled cash flow. The office remained quiet except for keyboards, printers, and the occasional low question carried between desks. No one needed to be told that the work mattered. Gideon waited near the window with both hands around a paper cup of coffee. At 2:17, Tessa returned with a property report. The Joliet facility was still pledged to Midwestern Commercial Bank under a revolving credit agreement. Stroud Industrial had offered the same asset to Gideon's company as supplier security 6 months later. That could be an error, Gideon said, though his voice lacked conviction. Marin turned another page. 1 error is possible. 2 requires an explanation. The second appeared before 4. A distribution warehouse in Indiana had been listed as collateral in an emergency financing package and separately represented as unencumbered property in a board presentation. The third was more subtle. Equipment at the oldest Stroud plant had been valued twice, once as operating assets and again inside a sale-leaseback proposal that had never closed. Marin placed the 3 reports side by side. Bennett was not simply delaying payments. He was using the same pieces of the company to tell different people different stories. Across town, Celeste Rourke sat in her office with the blinds lowered and the lender's review request open on her screen. She had spent 11 years at Stroud Industrial, first as controller, then treasurer, then chief financial officer. She believed in discipline, not loyalty theater. For months, she had warned Bennett that the expansion plan was consuming cash faster than the company could replace it. He responded by revising forecasts upward and excluding her from private lender calls. The latest board packet projected revenue from 2 contracts that had not been signed. When Celeste questioned the numbers, Bennett told her the market rewarded confidence. The market rewards results, she replied. He smiled. That is why I am chief executive. That evening, Celeste opened the system audit log and saw that her revenue assumptions had been changed after approval. The edit came from the executive floor. Her name remained attached to the final report. She printed the log, folded it once, and placed it inside her handbag. At Holloway Operations, Marin's team worked past sunset. Tessa built a timeline connecting the inflated orders to lender reporting dates. Gideon identified 3 other suppliers receiving the same payment extensions. Marin compared Bennett's public statements with internal capacity data she still understood from years inside the company. The pattern sharpened. Large orders were being placed just before quarterly reviews, then postponed or canceled after the reports were submitted. Future demand was being presented as current momentum. Inventory was becoming theater. At 8:30, the office phone rang. Tessa answered, listened, then covered the receiver. It is Celeste Rourke. Marin looked at the spread of records across the conference table. Put her through. Celeste's voice was low and controlled. I do not know what Gideon Pike gave you. Then why are you calling? A pause followed. Because Northline Capital requested an independent operational review this afternoon. Marin stood slowly. Northline led the creditor group holding Stroud's newest emergency loan. Who are they considering? 3 firms. Celeste exhaled. Holloway Operations is one of them. Through the glass wall, 12 people continued working beneath the soft office lights. Marin looked at the invoices, the duplicated collateral, and the access badge she once kept in the bottom drawer of her desk. Bennett had laughed because he counted employees. The lenders were beginning to count something else. Northline Capital did not choose Holloway Operations because Marin had once been married to Bennett Stroud. It chose her because 3 of its senior analysts had reviewed 7 years of restructuring results and found no inflated claims, no hidden fees, and no client that had been left weaker than before. The engagement letter arrived at 6:12 the next morning. It authorized a 30-day operational review of Stroud Industrial, including access to purchasing records, plant schedules, lender reports, executive forecasts, and board communications related to liquidity. Marin read every page before signing. The fee was significant for a firm of 12 people. But that was not what made her hand pause above the signature line. The final paragraph required Holloway Operations to report directly to Northline and the creditor committee, not to Bennett. For the first time, she would enter Stroud Industrial without needing his permission. Tessa stood beside the conference table with a fresh cup of coffee and watched her. "You can decline," she said. Marin looked through the glass wall at the office beginning to wake. One analyst was turning on desk lamps. Another was carrying a box of bagels from the corner shop. The printer near the supply room made the same uneven sound it had made for 3 years. Nothing about the room looked powerful, yet every person inside it had chosen accuracy over appearance. "No," Marin said. "We can do the work." She signed her name once, cleanly, then passed the letter to Tessa. By 8:30, the team had converted the small conference room into a project center. Whiteboards filled with timelines, creditor names, plant capacities, and supplier exposure. Marin assigned each person a narrow question rather than a broad suspicion. Which orders were real? Which assets were available? Which contracts had signatures? Which facilities generated cash? Which reports had been changed after internal approval? She did not ask them to prove Bennett had failed. She asked them to discover what was true. At Stroud headquarters, Bennett received the review notice during breakfast with Rowan in the executive dining room. He read the first page, then laughed once. Northline hired Marin. Rowan lowered her coffee cup. "That seems deliberate." "It is theater," he said. "They want to make me uncomfortable before refinancing." He called Celeste and ordered her to limit Holloway's access to documents already provided to lenders. Celeste listened without interrupting. "The engagement grants full operational access," she said. "Then interpret it narrowly. That would violate the agreement." Bennett looked across the table at Rowan, as though Celeste's answer were an inconvenience performed for an audience. "You work for Stroud Industrial." "I work for the company," Celeste replied. "That is what I said." Celeste ended the call and opened her desk drawer. Inside lay the printed audit log showing changes made under her name. She added the lender notice and closed the drawer again. At 10:15, Marin returned to the building where her badge had once been taken from her. The lobby had changed. The walls were darker, the security desk larger, and Bennett's portrait now hung beside the elevators beneath a plaque celebrating visionary leadership. Marin did not look away from it quickly. She simply noticed how carefully the photograph had been lit. Tessa stood on her right, carrying 2 locked cases of equipment. Behind them came 4 Holloway analysts, each wearing a temporary visitor badge. The security manager at the desk was the same man who had collected Marin's access card after the divorce. His hair had gone gray at the temples. When he saw her name on the authorization list, his eyes lifted with recognition and regret. "Ms. Holloway," he said, "your credentials are ready." He placed a white access badge on the counter. This one opened the executive floor, records department, finance offices, and all 4 manufacturing plants. Marin picked it up without comment. The plastic was light in her hand, but the moment carried the weight of every door that had once closed because Bennett believed access belonged to him. The elevator doors opened. Before Marin stepped inside, the security manager spoke quietly. "For what it is worth, I always knew who kept those plants organized." She met his eyes. "Then you know why we are here." On the 29th floor, Bennett waited outside the boardroom with Rowan beside him and 2 attorneys behind the glass. His smile held the same polished contempt he had worn at the awards dinner. "This should be entertaining," he said as Marin approached. She stopped several feet away. "It should be accurate." Bennett glanced at her temporary badge. 30 days does not make you part of this company." Marin turned the badge over once between her fingers, then looked past him toward the boardroom table. "That is not what Northline hired me to become." She walked around him without raising her voice. Bennett remained in the hallway while the 12-person firm he had mocked began opening the records his 3,000-person company could no longer afford to hide. By the end of the first week, Holloway Operations had turned the 29th floor conference room into a map of Stroud Industrial's hidden weaknesses. Marin's team worked without spectacle. They arrived before the executive assistants, carried coffee in paper cups, and left after the cleaning staff began dimming the hallway lights. Every conclusion had to survive 3 questions. What document supported it? Who approved it? And what happened to the cash? The answers were rarely dramatic by themselves. A canceled order here. A duplicated asset there. A warehouse filled with material no customer had requested. Together, they formed a picture Bennett could no longer dismiss as temporary. The largest problem was not debt. It was that Stroud Industrial had begun borrowing against a future that did not exist. Revenue forecasts included and signed contracts. Inventory had been valued as though every unit would sell at full price. Supplier payments had been delayed to preserve the appearance of cash. The company was still operating, but only because hundreds of smaller businesses had been forced to carry its weight. Marin understood that kind of imbalance. She had carried Bennett's ambition the same way, quietly, until he mistook her endurance for proof that he had built everything alone. On Thursday afternoon, Northline Capital sent its managing partner, Elias Mercer, to review the preliminary findings. Elias was 52, reserved, and known in financial circles for buying distressed companies only when he believed their employees and core business could still be protected. He arrived without an entourage, wearing a navy suit and carrying a plain leather notebook. Bennett met him in the lobby and attempted to redirect the meeting to the executive dining room. Elias declined. "I am here to hear from the people doing the review," he said. When he entered the conference room, Marin did not offer a polished presentation. She placed 4 folders in front of him. The first contained supplier exposure. The second showed duplicated collateral. The third compared reported revenue with signed customer contracts. The fourth listed the plants that could remain profitable if expansion spending stopped immediately. Elias read in silence for nearly 20 minutes. Bennett sat at the far end of the table, tapping one finger against the polished wood. Rowan remained beside him, taking notes that no one had requested. Celeste sat across from Marin with the audit log hidden inside her portfolio. "These are worst-case assumptions," Bennett said at last. Marin turned one page toward him. "These are signed obligations. You are treating normal growth costs as evidence of collapse." "Growth produces demand," she replied. "Your company produced paperwork." The room became still. Elias looked from the unsigned contracts to the warehouse reports. "How long before the company misses payroll?" Celeste answered before Bennett could speak. "At the current rate, 5 weeks." Bennett's finger stopped moving. He looked at her as though the betrayal were not the number, but her willingness to say it aloud. "That projection is not approved." Celeste opened her portfolio and placed the printed audit log on the table. "The approved projection was changed after my signature." Elias examined the document. "By whom?" Celeste did not look at Bennett. "The executive office." Rowan's pen froze above her notebook. For the first time since the review began, Bennett's confidence shifted. It did not disappear. It tightened. "This is becoming personal," he said. Marin closed the 4th folder. "No. Personal was taking my work and removing my name. This is arithmetic." Elias leaned back and studied her with an expression that held neither pity nor surprise. "What would you do if Northline required an immediate stabilization plan?" Bennett gave a quiet laugh. "She has 12 employees." Elias did not turn toward him. His attention remained on Marin. "I did not ask how many people she has. I asked whether she knows how to save the company." Marin looked through the glass wall at the city below, then at the plant reports arranged in front of her. She could protect the profitable facilities, pay the smallest suppliers first, and stop the expansion before it consumed what remained. She could also fail publicly inside the company that had once erased her. Bennett was counting on that fear. Marin opened her notebook to a blank page. "Give me 48 hours, she said. Elias nodded once. Bennett stared at her from the end of the table, still waiting for hesitation. It never came. For the next 48 hours, Holloway operations worked as if every hour had already been borrowed. Marin divided the stabilization plan into 3 columns. Protect payroll, restore supplier trust, and stop spending that produced no immediate return. Tessa traced every outstanding invoice under $250,000 because those belonged to the smaller vendors most likely to collapse first. 2 analysts reviewed plan output by shift instead of by quarterly average. Another rebuilt the cash forecast using only signed contracts and confirmed purchase orders. Marin moved from desk to desk with a yellow legal pad, asking the same quiet question each time. What happens next if this number is wrong? At midnight, the conference room smelled like coffee, printer toner, and the takeout containers no one had finished. Rain tapped against the glass above the Chicago River. The city below looked calm in the way numbers sometimes looked calm before someone examined them closely. At 1:15 in the morning, Tessa found the opening they needed. Stroud Industrial had 3 distribution centers operating under separate service contracts, yet 2 handled overlapping territory. Consolidating the routes would save nearly $8 million a year without closing a manufacturing plant. At 2:40, another analyst identified an unused executive aircraft lease costing the company almost $190,000 each month. At 3:10, Marin found 6 consulting contracts approved by Bennett's office that duplicated work already performed by internal teams. None of those contracts saved the company alone. Together, they created enough breathing room to protect payroll for 13 weeks. Just before sunrise, Marin stood by the conference room window with both hands around a paper cup. Years earlier, Bennett had called her cautious whenever she questioned expansion. He made caution sound small, as though restraint belonged to people afraid of winning. Now the company needed the very thing he had mocked, someone willing to separate ambition from survival. By Friday afternoon, the plan filled 27 pages. It suspended speculative expansion, froze executive bonuses, ended redundant contracts, consolidated distribution, and established a supplier repayment schedule beginning with the smallest firms. It also required independent approval for any financial statements sent to lenders. Tessa read the final page and looked up. He will never accept this voluntarily. Marin capped her pen. He does not have to like it. He has to choose between oversight and insolvency. At 3 o'clock, Elias Mercer returned with 2 Northline attorneys and representatives from the creditor committee. Bennett arrived 10 minutes late, followed by Rowan and a private lawyer. He placed his phone on the table and looked at the plan without opening it. I understand Marin has prepared a list of cuts, he said. A stabilization plan, Elias corrected. For a company that does not need stabilizing. Celeste slid a cash report toward him. Payroll is due in 32 days. Bennett did not touch it. We have receivables. Some are disputed, Marin said. Others belong to contracts that are still unsigned. He turned toward her. You always did mistake fear for discipline. The words reached across the table with the familiarity of an old wound, but Marin did not lower her eyes. And you always mistook delay for proof that consequences were not coming. Elias opened the plan. He moved through each section slowly, asking about plant capacity, vendor exposure, and cash preservation. Marin answered with names, dates, and verified amounts. No flourish. No accusation. When he reached the executive compensation page, Bennett leaned forward. You are freezing bonuses based on projections created by a firm smaller than my communications department. Based on available cash, Marin replied. Rowan glanced toward him, but said nothing. Elias closed the report. Northline will release emergency funding. Under these conditions. Bennett's expression hardened. And if I refuse? One of the attorneys placed a second document on the table. The creditor agreement allows Northline to appoint an independent restructuring officer after a material reporting breach. Silence settled over the room. Bennett finally looked at Celeste's audit log, the altered forecasts, and the duplicated collateral schedules. For the first time, the decision in front of him could not be redirected with confidence. Who would you appoint, he asked. Elias looked across the table at Marin. That discussion comes after the board vote Monday morning. Marin gathered her notes and stood. Bennett watched her with the same disbelief he had worn when she asked for a title years before. Only now the room was no longer waiting for his permission. Outside the boardroom, the hallway lights reflected against her temporary badge. She pressed the elevator button and listened to the doors open. Behind her, Bennett remained seated before a plan built by 12 people, each page narrowing the distance between the company he claimed to control and the truth he could no longer dismiss. Monday morning arrived beneath a low gray sky, and the boardroom windows turned the city into a field of muted steel. Marin entered at 8:40 with Tessa on one side and Elias Mercer on the other. She wore the same amethyst suit Bennett had mocked at the awards dinner, not because she wanted him to remember, but because she had stopped dressing around anyone else's comfort. The board members were already seated. Some avoided her eyes. Others studied the 27-page stabilization plan as though it had appeared from nowhere. Bennett stood at the head of the table, one hand resting on the back of his chair. Rowan sat near the wall with her notebook closed. Celeste placed 3 sealed folders before the directors, each containing the audit logs, lender notices, and duplicated collateral records. Before this meeting begins, Bennett said, I want the board to understand that this review was shaped by personal history. Marin set her legal pad on the table. The invoices do not have a personal history. His mouth tightened. You built a consulting practice by criticizing companies from the outside. That does not qualify you to control one. Elias opened the creditor agreement. This meeting is not about qualifications in the abstract. It is about a material reporting breach, a liquidity emergency, and the conditions required for Northline to release funding. Bennett turned toward the directors. Stroud Industrial has survived recessions, supply shocks, and labor shortages. We will not hand authority to a 12-person firm because a lender is nervous. The oldest board member, Margaret Lynn, adjusted her glasses. The lender is not nervous, Bennett. The lender has evidence. Celeste opened the first folder and walked the board through each altered forecast. She showed wherein signed contracts had been entered as expected revenue, where collateral had been listed twice, and where her approved assumptions had been replaced after submission. She did not raise her voice. She did not look toward Bennett for permission. Each page made the room quieter. When she finished, Margaret turned to him. Did you authorize these changes? Bennett leaned back. I authorized optimistic modeling. Did you authorize your office to attach Celeste's name after the assumptions changed? He looked toward his attorney. That glance answered more than words could have. Marin watched the directors shift in their seats. For years, Bennett had controlled rooms by deciding which questions deserved answers. Now every silence belonged to someone else. Elias distributed the proposed resolution. It required immediate adoption of the stabilization plan, suspension of Bennett's unilateral spending authority, and appointment of an independent restructuring officer with full operational control for 90 days. Bennett read the first page, then gave a short, disbelieving laugh. This is absurd. It is the condition for emergency funding, Elias said. Without it, Northline will not release the next credit advance. Then we find another lender. Margaret closed her folder. With what financial statements? The question landed without force and still left nowhere for him to move. Bennett looked toward Rowan. She lowered her eyes. He looked toward Celeste. She held his gaze without apology. Then he looked at Marin, searching for the hesitation he had always believed he could summon. You planned this, he said. You waited for the company to weaken so you could walk back in and prove something. Marin folded her hands on the table. I did not create the debt. I did not change the forecasts. I did not delay suppliers until they had to choose between payroll and keeping your account. You expect me to believe this is not revenge? Her voice remained level. Revenge would be letting the company collapse because your name is on the building. I am here because 3,000 employees should not lose their livelihoods to protect one man's pride. Margaret called for the vote. One by one, the directors raised their hands. The first resolution passed unanimously. The second passed with one abstention. Bennett remained standing while the authority he had treated as permanent moved across the table through signatures, dates, and quiet legal language. Elias turned to Marin. Northline nominates Marin Holloway as independent restructuring officer. Bennett's face went still. She is not taking control of my company. Margaret looked at the resolution in front of her. It stopped being only your company when everyone else began carrying the cost of your decisions. The final vote began. Marin did not smile. She did not look away. Outside the windows, the morning light broke through the clouds in a thin silver line as the board decided whether the woman Bennett once removed without a title would return with the authority to sign above his name. The final resolution passed with 6 votes in favor and 1 abstention. For several seconds, no one moved. The decision did not sound like victory. It sounded like paper sliding across polished wood, pens returning to the table, and one quiet breath leaving Bennett Stroud's chest as the authority he had guarded for years transferred into Marin's hands. Elias placed the signed resolution before her. Effective immediately, he said. You have full operational control for 90 days, subject to creditor oversight and weekly board reporting. Marin read the first page before she touched the pen. She had learned long ago that power became dangerous when treated like a reward. This was not a crown. It was a responsibility attached to 3,000 paychecks, dozens of suppliers, and families who would never know her name. She signed once. Bennett remained at the head of the table, but the position no longer meant what it had an hour earlier. "This is temporary," he said. 90 days is enough to destroy a company you do not understand. Marin closed the folder. "I understand exactly what is failing. You understand spreadsheets. I understand the people those spreadsheets represent." Margaret Lynn asked Bennett to surrender his unrestricted executive access until the board completed its governance review. His attorney leaned toward him and spoke under his breath. Bennett stared at Marin, then removed the black access card from his wallet and set it on the table. Years earlier, security had taken her badge while he watched from 10 feet away. Now no guard stood beside him. No one needed to. The card rested between them like a sentence completed by time. Marin did not look pleased. She passed it to Celeste. "Please have information technology issue the approved access level." Bennett gave a humorless smile. "No speech. The employees need instructions before the afternoon shift," she said. "That matters more." By noon, Holloway Operations had established a temporary command center in the executive conference room. Tessa coordinated plant managers across 4 states, while Celeste released revised cash controls. Every non-essential executive expense was frozen. The aircraft lease was terminated. Redundant consulting agreements were suspended pending review. Most important, Marin authorized the first supplier payments under the new schedule. Gideon Pike's company received confirmation that its oldest invoices would be paid within 10 business days. He called her 5 minutes later and could not speak at first. "My people were preparing for reduced hours," he finally said. "You just changed that." Marin looked through the glass wall at her 12-person team working around a table designed for twice as many. "Your employees kept Stroud running," she said. "They should not be punished for it." At 3 in the afternoon, she held a company-wide video meeting. Plant managers, warehouse supervisors, accountants, and office staff appeared across dozens of small screens. Some looked frightened. Others looked exhausted. Bennett stood near the back of the boardroom, no longer centered beneath the company emblem. Marin did not discuss his failures. She explained what would happen next. Payroll would continue. No manufacturing plant would close during the initial review. Supplier relationships would be repaired in order of urgency. Employees closest to the work would be asked where money and time were being lost. "For too long," she said, "this company rewarded people for making problems sound smaller. Starting today, no one will be punished for telling the truth early." A plant supervisor in Michigan raised his hand. "Does that include telling the executive office when a target is impossible?" Marin looked toward Bennett, then back at the screen. Especially then. The first week under her control was not dramatic. It was disciplined. Purchase orders were matched to real demand. Empty freight routes were consolidated. Managers were required to sign forecasts they could defend. At the oldest plant, workers showed Marin a packaging line that had been slowed for months by a maintenance request no executive had approved. The repair cost less than 1 day of Bennett's aircraft lease. Production improved before the week ended. On Friday evening, Elias reviewed the preliminary cash report. The company had preserved enough liquidity to extend payroll protection from 13 weeks to 17. Supplier cancellations had slowed. 2 customers who had delayed contracts agreed to return to negotiations after receiving verified production data. Bennett stood outside the conference room while Marin presented the results to the creditor committee. Through the glass, he watched directors lean toward her instead of him. When the meeting ended, he waited until the others had gone. "You wanted them to see you replace me," he said. Marin gathered the reports into a neat stack. "I wanted them to see the company clearly. Do you think this makes you better than me?" She lifted the temporary badge from the table and clipped it to her jacket. "No, it makes me accountable." Bennett looked at the badge, then at the office beyond her, where 12 people continued working under the evening lights. He had spent years believing size created authority. Now his company moved according to decisions made by the small firm he had laughed at, and Marin did not need to remind him. The silence did it for her. 90 days later, the boardroom looked smaller than Marin remembered. The same glass walls framed the Chicago skyline. The same polished table reflected the morning light, and the same silver emblem hung behind the chair Bennett once treated like a throne. Yet the room no longer seemed built around him. The final restructuring report rested before each director, 143 pages reduced to a few undeniable results. Payroll had remained uninterrupted. Supplier debt had fallen by 38%. 3 delayed customer contracts had been signed after the company replaced inflated forecasts with verified production schedules. The oldest plant was profitable again. More than 3,000 employees still had jobs. Elias Mercer sat beside Margaret Lynn, while Celeste prepared the final cash summary. Tessa waited near the end of the table with the Holloway team's closing files stacked neatly before her. Bennett arrived last. He had lost the effortless confidence that once entered rooms ahead of him, though his suit remained perfect and his expression carefully controlled. Rowan was no longer beside him. 2 weeks after the board vote, she had resigned from corporate communications, explaining in a brief letter that she could not defend statements she had not been allowed to verify. Bennett took his seat without greeting anyone. Margaret called the meeting to order. Celeste presented the financial results first, naming each repaired weakness without decorating the truth. Then Elias reviewed the creditor position. Northline would refinance the emergency debt under stricter governance, but only if the board made the new controls permanent. No executive could alter approved forecasts without recorded review. No asset could be pledged twice. No expansion could begin without confirmed demand. When he finished, Margaret turned to Marin. Your 90-day appointment ends today? What is your recommendation for leadership? Bennett looked at her then, fully and directly. For weeks, rumors had moved through the company that Marin would remove him, claim the chief executive role, and turn Stroud Industrial into proof of her revenge. She had answered none of them. Marin opened the final folder. The company does not need another leader who believes one person should hold every answer, she said. It needs a permanent chief executive selected through an independent process, supported by a board willing to question that person. Margaret nodded. And Mr. Stroud? Marin looked toward Bennett. He should step down from executive authority. He may retain the ownership rights allowed under the revised agreement, but he should not control daily operations. Bennett's jaw tightened. So that is the ending you wanted. Marin closed the folder. No. The ending I wanted years ago was a seat at the table and my name on the work I had done. That ending is gone. The room held still. This is not about taking your place, she continued. It is about making sure no one can erase the truth simply because their name is on the building. Margaret called for the vote. The resolution passed unanimously. Bennett lowered his eyes to the table. There was no applause, no public humiliation, and no triumphant speech waiting for him. Only the soft sound of signatures and the finality of people who had stopped confusing confidence with competence. After the meeting, the directors left one by one. Elias shook Marin's hand and thanked her. Celeste gathered the reports. Tessa carried the locked cases toward the elevator. Bennett remained near the window. You could have taken the company, he said. Marin stood beside the chair she had never asked to inherit. I never wanted your company. He looked at her, disbelief giving way to something quieter. Then why did you stay? She glanced through the glass toward the floors. Below, where phones rang, machines ran, and thousands of people continued the ordinary work of building a life. Because they deserved better than the choice you gave them. Bennett looked down at the city. Were you waiting for an apology? Marin considered the question. Once, she had imagined one. She had imagined him admitting that the systems were hers, the recovery was hers, and the success he wore so proudly had been carried on work he refused to name. But the woman who needed that confession had cried in a parking garage years ago, and then built something honest above a printing shop. No, she said. I stopped waiting a long time ago. She unclipped the temporary Stroud badge from her jacket and placed it on the table. Then she picked up her own Holloway Operations identification card, the one bearing her name, her title, and the company she had built without anyone's permission. At the elevator, Tessa asked whether she felt victorious. Marin watched the boardroom doors close behind them. I feel free, she said. Downstairs, 12 members of her team waited in the lobby with paper coffee cups and tired smiles. Marin joined them without looking back. She had not won Bennett again, and she had not needed to destroy him. She had recovered the one thing he could never return because it had never truly belonged to him. Herself.